Welcome back to Worst Seats in the House. Michael Russo and Anthony LaPanta coming to you from the Aquarius Home Services studio, which is at the Fairmont Pacific Rim in Vancouver, overlooking the incredible Stanley Park and the water and the seaplanes and all that stuff. Quiet trade deadline for the Wild, unless you kind of take it back a month and you bring in, Vinny Hinestroza and Gus Nyquist as part of it. But last night, the Wild acquired Justin Brazeau from the Boston Bruins and trade them a 2026 sixth-round pick, Jacob Lauko and Murat Huznadinov. Those were the two guys that I thought most likely would be going if it was a dollar-for-dollar trade. As we talked on the last podcast, Anthony, when Bill Guerin at the Sunday presser, made it sound like it was only for cap reasons that Huznadinov was sent down and refused to critique his game. It just felt like somebody that was not about to critique somebody's game right before putting him on the market. And then Lauko, as we've talked about, has had the hip and groin issues. I think availability is the biggest thing for a hockey player. I don't think they were really too confident that he was going to be available through the rest of the season and playoffs with what he's dealing with. So they essentially trade Huznadinov for Brazeau and then the sixth to get them, the Boston Bruins, to take Lauko. What do you think of the move?
It surprised me a little bit, only in that it seems early in the career of Huznadinov to give up on a player, and you and I have talked about him for a couple of years, and I think he has a really low ceiling personally, so I don't think they gave up much there. Lauko, I don't really know about the injury status part, because he did bring some speed when he was healthy. And so on the surface, you say, all right, you have two players and a pick to bring in one guy. But Billy today was pretty clear where he just said it's a different type of player. It's a bigger, more physical player. Those other guys brought something different. So we'll see how that fits. But I think the point you made first is the right one, that to just look at the trade deadline and say the Wild did nothing today. They added Gus Nyquist. They added Vinny Hinestroza. They add Brazeau, and now hopefully their big trade deadline addition is the health of their all players they already control in Brodin, Eriksson Ek, and Kaprizov. So while some other teams certainly made bigger splashes, I think Minnesota's hoping that their trade deadline splash is getting all those guys back plus the three players they added. And now all of a sudden you could have a lineup that looks significantly deeper than it did, say, a month ago.
Right, and that's obviously the hope is, in a season full of injuries, that they're going to come back, but also nobody else will be out, and that'll be interesting. And that's what Bill Guerin made clear today, is that, he's well aware that teams like Tampa Bay and Vegas have done the LTIR magic the last several years to bring in players at the deadline, although strangely Vegas didn't do that today when they had Shea Theodore the ability to do that. So maybe they struck out on something else or a couple things. But that the Wild were not willing to do that, believing that Kaprizov, Eriksson Ek, and Lauko, and Brodin will be back at some point the rest of this regular season. And Bill Guerin made it extremely clear today that if they wanted Kaprizov on this team before the regular season ends, that they couldn't do anything. And the big thing with Kaprizov is, as you and I have talked about, is that even though he might not be skating for 2 or 3 more weeks, that he likes runways leading up to the playoffs. And so even if they can get him 2 or 3 games before the playoffs, Anthony, they weren't willing to go out and put him on season-ending LTIR today, and to go out and give up the huge assets that it would take to get a player.
Yeah, I think that's the bigger thing, is that even if you have the cap space, the prices for these players, I think, was absurd. And you look at what Carolina was able to get for Mikko Rantanen, who they couldn't sign anyway. And so let's just say, for example, that Minnesota was going to say Kirill Kaprizov's on season-ending LTIR, so now we can go make a run at Mikko Rantanen, or we can go make a run at Brock Nelson. Or you look at the return those players got, and I wouldn't have been willing to give that anyway. Dallas gives Logan Stankoven and 2 first-round picks to get Rantanen to come in. And Rantanen's a great player, but that's a lot to give up. And I don't think the Wild are in a spot where they would have been willing to give that up even if the dollars fit.
And to that point, the reason why they gave up that much is that he was willing to sign an 8-year deal in Dallas, which for Minnesota it would have had to have been a rental, because they are going to try to re-sign Kirill Kaprizov this offseason. And there's no guarantee. As we saw with Rantanen, he didn't even want to go to Carolina, which is a perennial contender. So clearly you're not giving that up. And then with Brock Nelson, too, they get first a top prospect, contract, all that.
Right. There's no way that the Wild give up. Caleb Ritchie, the player that went to the Islanders in that deal, was pretty widely viewed as Colorado's top prospect. So think about the equivalent to that for Minnesota. Are they going to give Urov and a first-round pick and another defenseman just to get Brock Nelson in here? I just don't think, even if the dollars had been available, I don't think that the market was right for Minnesota to go after any of these players. And the truth is that if Kirill Kaprizov isn't back and healthy for a playoff run, it doesn't matter anyway, because then adding a player like this to try to make a run in this year's playoffs would have been foolish. So I do think some of those other teams, if you don't look at future pieces that they had to give up, if you just look at how it affected their roster today, Colorado's deals were terrific. To add Brock Nelson, to add Charlie Coyle, and essentially lose Casey Middlestad off of this roster, that's a big plus. For Dallas, they replaced Stankoven with Rantanen. That makes them better this year. They're both going to pay the price in future years for these deals that they made this week. And I think if you're Minnesota and you look and say, if Kirill Kaprizov was going at the same pace he was going earlier this year, let's say he's a 100-point guy, and Joel Eriksson's healthy, and Brodin's healthy, and you kind of have a better handle on what you have, then maybe you're more willing to say, all right, let's take a shot, part with an asset, and let it rip in this year's playoffs, even if you still think your best years are a couple of years down the road. But that's just not the case right now. And I think with any uncertainty going into the postseason of just not knowing for sure, and I know Billy today was like, I know these guys are going to be back. Well, you know that you might know they're going to be back, but are they going to be back at 100%? Are they going to be back playing at the pace, at the level they were before the injury? And if you don't know that 100% for certain, then adding a piece like a Brock Nelson, let's say, I don't think is worth what it would have taken to get him in terms of assets going the other way.
Right, and obviously Colorado might now resign and extend the contract to Brock Nelson.
Might. But I mean,
again,
what you had to give up to get him right now is huge.
Right, and to me, obviously I would assume if the Wild gave up that type of package that Brock Nelson would be extending there, but then you're going to extend, then you're giving up a bunch of assets for a guy that you were going to try to re-sign anyway. Now the risk is that if they really want him, that maybe Colorado, signs him and you don't get him, but then you do some other stuff. And as Bill said today, their day will come. And, as I wrote in yesterday's Athletic, I think that the goal here at the deadline, especially knowing that the prices were going to be exorbitant, was that they wanted to go into this offseason fully loaded to maybe make some trades and trade some players. And so we'll see if that happens here. A couple of years ago and last year, there was a big arms race in the Eastern Conference and only one team can win the cup. You remember the year that the Rangers added Kane and Tarasenko and everybody else in the East made huge moves. You do that and then eventually you wind up having to pay the price here and we'll see obviously what happens. My biggest concern here is when are these guys going to be coming back? Bill was not letting us know anything remotely like that today. Basically said it's none of our business, which I obviously, as you witnessed, had a nice fun back and forth with him. But the concern now is that you trade Murat Husnudinov and you have one injury to Rossi, Goudreau, Hartman, or Devin Shore, and now you're dealing with Ben Jones in the lineup and Brandon Gantz, and without knowing when Eriksson is going to be back or if he's going to be 100% in a season that we have just had to witness injury after injury after injury. They've definitely left themselves, I think, woefully lacking in depth right now.
Yeah, maybe, but and this will sound maybe more harsh than it really is, but what's the difference between Murat Husnudinov and Ben Jones? Mm-hmm. There just isn't much difference, in my opinion. I think your Brendan Gantz, Shore looked fine in the middle. I just don't think I don't think there's that big of a drop off there from here to the finish. You're talking about for the next 6 weeks.
Right.
And that's if you happen to lose another center. Because, right now Ryan Hartman, he's certainly capable of playing in the middle. So I think I don't really see Murat Husnudinov as an irreplaceable part, even as a depth guy. I mean, you might be 2 injuries, 3 injuries away from before you're going to get to a point where you got a guy who's a lot different than him in your lineup. And, I mean, what do you lose if you play Ben Jones instead of him? I just don't think you lose that much.
Right. Now, I wonder about the future. We'll have to see. I think you and I are both in agreement that we both don't see it with Husnudinov, but I will say and I was saying that he was an unfinished product. So I will say the big thing with Brazo, that to me is the one that will be interesting, is you lose a lot of speed. I mean, Husandino is one of the fastest players in the league. Jacob Lauko is very fast. This team is not nearly as fast in the past, and without seeing him yet, the book on Justin Brazo is that he's not very fast at all, not a great skater. What he brings is size that the Wild have needed in the playoffs the last couple of years, and a net front guy, both in the bottom six and on the power play that the Wild haven't had in the playoffs, perennially. I mean, what do you think of the move? Do you know much about him? All that type of stuff.
Not really. I did a little digging today, and his scoring numbers in the American Hockey League have been impressive. First half of this year, he was scoring in the National Hockey League in a bottom six role with a little bit of time on special teams, but he had 20 points in the first 35 games of the year or something like that, and 38 games maybe. I know he's been in a slump lately. I always am concerned when you replace speed with size, but I've also been the guy who has downplayed the lack of size a number of times, and I think it's fair to say that has been an undoing or a challenge for this team late in seasons and in the playoffs. So I think teams can look a lot faster if you're efficient with the puck, and the Wild haven't been very efficient with the puck here lately. That can help negate some of the lack of speed. But I always think the way this league is played right now is that speed's tough to top. And we'll see. I do think there's been enough evidence over the last couple of years that the lack of size for the Wild has hurt them. So I think that's probably what Billy sees, where he says this is the type of player that we felt we needed something different than what those guys brought. They're well aware of what they were giving up and the speed of those two players, but I think just looked at it and said we just need a bigger, more rugged guy that brings a little bit different kind of offense to the table.
Obviously, we're here in Vancouver. Big news is that Brock Besser was not traded. Was on the ice. Will play against the Wild tonight. I think they've started talking contract again. Patrick Allvin met with the media today and basically said you wouldn't believe the crummy offers I got for Besser, which was actually, interestingly, that was why I was keeping my radar up today. Is you just wondered if if all of a sudden you could get Besser for a bargain, then maybe Billy would LTI one of those guys and make the move. But clearly they weren't just going to give him away, and maybe Billy actually made that call and tried to get him for 10 cents on the dollar, and it didn't work. But shocking to me that Besser just couldn't go anywhere.
Well, a little bit surprising, and when you look at what some of the teams that were willing to pay for other guys, I actually thought that's why the Wild pulled the trigger when they did on Gus Nyquist.
Yeah.
Was to just be ahead of the game a little bit, because when you look at the standings, there were so many teams, and even go back to the Brock Nelson trade. The Islanders are only 4 points out of a playoff spot. It wasn't a given that they were going to say, all right, let's move this guy. And with so many teams still alive in the East particularly, but even in the West, I just think there were fewer sellers, more buyers, and that was driving the price up. And I think that's why the Wild just tried to get ahead of it and say, let's grab Nyquist now rather than get close to the deadline. And if he's really the level that we think we might be able to find a guy, you'd hate to see that price go up at the last minute. And I think we saw that with some of the other guys. That's why it's a little bit surprising that nobody was willing to nibble on Besser if you're just kind of comparing what some of the other players got at the deadline. That's probably why Vancouver said, wait a minute, if this guy's getting this and this guy's getting this and this guy's getting this, we need more for Besser.
Yeah, and you can't argue that. A couple more minutes, Anthony. And by the way, our next live show is March 12th, 7 p.m. at Elsie's. Write that down, Anthony. It is, the one team that was most fascinating to me was the Boston Bruins. Talk about an absolute fire sale. You send Brazo here, Carlo's gone, Coyle's gone, Marchand's gone, Frederick's gone. They did get Husandino and Connor Durr, so they'll be teammates again. But man, Brad Marchand in Florida, We saw today Luke Cunning going to Columbus to play for Dean Evison again. Charlie Coyle going to be playing for the team where he separated two shoulders against in the 2014 playoffs. What was the most fascinating part of today's deadline for you, other than the Rantanen and the Nelson and things like that?
Yeah, I thought the Rantanen deal was maybe the most surprising, only because of the fact that he had turned down more money in Carolina, and the fact that Dallas got him to accept $12 million a year, and to say accept might be a little bit of a strong term, but it almost looked like it was unlikely he was going to end up going anywhere. But good for Carolina to get the return they did for him. Marchand to Florida is maybe the one that every time guys get traded, there are a few deals where it just is never going to look right to see that player in that uniform, and I think Marchand to Florida might be the best example of that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine seeing him playing next to some of those guys with the battles those two teams have had in the playoffs the last couple of years.
Well, I thought that during the Four Nations when he was on playing with and even on a line with Sam Bennett. I mean, just think about that. Last year in the playoffs, I was there for that Boston-Florida series, and Bennett had that dirty play where he hits them, but then he throws the sucker punch and concussed him. And they play together in the Four Nations, and now they're going to be teammates. It's going to be absolutely fascinating. So right now, I got to tell you, the team that I think that I wasn't impressed with before and didn't know if they could go and be a true Cup contender is Colorado. I love the moves they did. I think adding Charlie Coyle and Brock Nelson really loads them up. Obviously, they beat the crap out of San Jose last night with McKinnon getting 5 points and McCarr getting 6. But right now, if you had a guess coming out of the West, who is it?
I still like Dallas more than I like Colorado. Colorado, to me, the bigger question is they have to get goaltending, and I'm just not totally sold on Mackenzie Blackwood. I don't think they're deep enough on the blue line. I do think the guys they added are the exact type of guys they needed. They were thin with their forward lines. They were such a top-heavy group. And so I think these moves were good for this year for them. But I've thought all year long that it was, and I did think Colorado was still a contender just because of those big guns. But I've thought from the beginning this season that Dallas and Vegas were the best constructed rosters in the West. I know Vegas was pretty quiet at the deadline. I still think those two teams are the two that if I had to guess right now, it's going to come down to those two at the end in the West.
Yeah. Vegas brings back Riley Smith, but really quiet from there. Well, that's your bonus podcast, March 12th at 7 p.m. Elsie's is your next live show. Appreciate you doing this, Anthony. As Bill Guerin said today, the Wild will have their day. But I do think, Anthony, the pressure's on Bill now. Like, the 4 years are over. The buyout pain is over. We're not going to be talking about again. They've got to re-sign Kaprizov. It was a testy exchange today, so you could just tell that he's feeling the stress. I'm sure he didn't love being an outsider in today's talks. But there just comes a point now where the fans have been patient. The organization has been patient. He bought them 4 years. That's expiring after this season. Now's the time to turn this team into a perennial contender.
Yeah, I don't think I don't know how many times we've talked about it and I've always said I think the way when you evaluate Billy's plan was next year. Mm-hmm. And that it doesn't mean you have to win the Cup next year, but I think going into the season and into the playoffs, you have to have a roster that's looked at as, like we're talking right now about who's the team to beat in the West, and we throw out Dallas, Vegas, and maybe Colorado. If Minnesota's not in that conversation next year, then I think you have to question what they've done to get to that point. Because I felt like everything was geared to making sure that going into that 25-26 season that the Wild were one of the legitimate contenders in the West. I think they've got the pieces in place. They've got the foundation there. They've got the basic part of the roster. They got to add a couple tweaks to it, a couple pieces this summer. But yeah, I mean, but I keep going back to, if you had told Wild fans, we're going to do this, and for these 4 years, we're going to have a couple 100-point seasons, we're going to be in the playoffs 3 out of 4 years during this process, I think everybody raises their hand and says, I'll take that. If going into 25-26, you're now looked at as one of the legit contenders. And like I said, that doesn't mean you have to win it that year or even make a run that year, because goofy things can happen, injuries, puck luck, whatever in a postseason. But I just think you know what a contender looks like, and if the Wild are a team that, when those playoffs are rolling around next year, that they're saying, hey, who are the teams to beat? It's Minnesota, it's Dallas, it's Vegas. Then your plan is probably working.
And to your point, I'm sure the New Jersey Devils looked at themselves as a true contender. The next thing you know, Jack Hughes breaks his shoulder in half.
You can't control that.
Yep, exactly. Well, thanks a lot. Awesome to do this. Thanks to our sponsors, Aquarius Home Services, your local authorized dealer for Connecticut water treatment systems, Clamshell Beach Resorts, Twill in the Diana Galleria, Giggly, THC Beverages, Onyx Maps, Royal Credit Union, and Feller's Ranch. March 12th, 7 p.m. at Elsie's. Talk to you then, everybody.
So much coming out, there's nothing